Hello everyone, I'm 90 years old now, and throughout more than 6 decades of practicing medicine, I've had the privilege of walking alongside thousands of elderly patients during the final chapter of their lives. This was never just a profession, it became a sacred journey. One where I learned time and time again that life doesn't end all at once. It fades quietly, gradually, and it always leaves behind signs. Most people think death arrives suddenly, but those who have cared for a loved one nearing the end know differently. The body speaks, softly, long before it lets go. A change in appetite, shifts in sleep, moments of silence. These are not just coincidences. They are the soul's way of preparing, of saying goodbye in a language deeper than words. In this video, I want to share with you not just 5, but 10 subtle signs that I've come to recognize after a lifetime in this work. These signs often appear in the last year, the last 6 months, or even just weeks before someone passes, and my purpose in sharing them is not to alarm you, but to help you see, feel, and love more fully during the time that remains. I believe that when we learn to recognize the quiet signals of life's final season, we also learn how to be present, how to soften, how to let go with grace. So if you have aging parents, grandparents, or a beloved elder who may be approaching their final journey, I invite you to stay with me in this video. Let us listen together, for in these 10 signs lie opportunities. Opportunities to be still, to be kind, to show love in its simplest and most powerful form, our presence. Let's begin. 1. Extended sleep and shifts in daily rhythms. Over the years, I've sat beside countless bedsides, and one of the earliest signs I often noticed was this: longer and deeper sleep. Not just naps here and there, but a kind of full-body retreat into rest. Many of my elderly patients would begin sleeping 16, even 20 hours a day, and the hours when they were awake, scattered, unpredictable. Sometimes at dawn, sometimes in the middle of the night. At first, families would worry, should we try to keep them awake during the day, they'd ask. But I would gently tell them, this isn't just fatigue. It's the nervous system beginning to let go. The body no longer follows the rhythms of clocks and calendars. It begins to follow the quieter rhythm of transition. You see, this kind of sleep is sacred. It's not a problem to solve, it's a preparation. And rather than trying to bring them back into our pace of life, I always encourage families to enter theirs, to wait for those rare and precious moments of alertness, and to be fully present when they come. Even if your loved one is only awake for 10 minutes, that window matters more than you know. A smile, a soft greeting, the simple act of sitting together in silence. These are the moments that stay long after words are gone. And over time, as sleep deepens, another change often appears. Not just in how much rest they need, but in the energy that remains when they are awake. It's a quiet slowing down that touches every movement, every breath. And that brings us to the next sign, one that speaks to the deeper kind of weariness I've come to know well. 2. A softening of speech and language. As sleep deepens and the body begins to conserve energy, another change often follows. More subtle, but just as profound. The words begin to fade. I remember so many moments when a patient, once talkative and expressive, suddenly began to speak less. Their sentences would trail off. Their thoughts would pause mid-air. Sometimes their words became slurred or hard to understand. Other times they would whisper quietly to someone who wasn't there. An old friend long gone, a sibling from childhood, even a parent they hadn't spoken of in decades. At first, this startled many families. Who is she talking to, they would ask me. But over time, I learned not to see this as confusion, but as connection. Not with us, perhaps, but with something or someone beyond what we can see. You see, when language begins to falter, it's not always because the mind is failing. Sometimes it's because the soul is turning inward. The effort to form sentences, to explain, to stay in step with the world becomes too heavy. And so they begin to speak in fragments, in whispers, or not at all. When this happens, My advice is always the same. Don't correct. Don't pull them back into our version of clarity. Instead, listen with your heart. Answer with your presence. A soft hand on theirs. A gentle nod. A whisper in return. Even if they may not fully understand the words, because even when speech fades, connection doesn't. In fact, in those quiet moments, when words disappear and only presence remains, I've seen some of the most powerful expressions of love. And as language fades, something else often begins to stir. Not with words, but with memory. You may notice them reaching back, not just days or months, but decades, recalling old stories, lost names, distant faces. And that brings us to the next sign, when the mind begins its quiet return to the past. 3. A quiet letting go of former interests. After speech begins to soften and the past gently resurfaces, another shift often unfolds, one that is less about words and more about where the heart chooses to rest. Over the years, I've watched people slowly lose interest in the things that once defined them. A woman who always styled her hair each morning suddenly stops asking for her comb. A gentleman who never missed the evening news no longer asks to turn on the TV. Favorite meals, crossword puzzles, even beloved hobbies, they all begin to fade into the background. And families often ask me, is she depressed or has he given up? But I've come to see it differently. This isn't apathy, it's not despair, it's a quiet, inner reorientation. The mind is turning inward, preparing not in fear, but in acceptance. The external world, with all its little routines and distractions, simply loses its grip. What once felt important no longer holds the same meaning. And that, to me, is not a loss. It's a form of grace. A deep knowing that something more essential is coming into view. So instead of trying to bring them back into our world, reminding them about the weather, the news, or what they used to enjoy, I've learned to meet them gently, right where they are. A simple question like, what would feel good for you today, can go further than any effort to recreate the past. Or perhaps just sitting beside them quietly, without expectation, offering your presence as a gift. Because when the outer world no longer matters, what remains is something more timeless. And it is often in this inward stillness that something extraordinary begins to happen. Some people start seeing or speaking to loved ones long gone. Others describe places they've never been, gardens, rivers, light. And that brings us to the next sign, a moment when the veil seems to grow thinner between this world and whatever lies beyond. 4. Moments of unexpected clarity. Just when everything seems to be slowing down, something remarkable can happen. I've seen it more times than I can count, and yet it still moves me every single time. After days, even weeks of silence, sleep, or distant gazes, a patient suddenly becomes alert again. They sit up in bed, they smile, they ask for their favorite meal. Some even laugh, tell stories, or call out the names of loved ones with a clarity that seems to have returned from nowhere. To the unknowing eye, it looks like a miracle. Families rush in, filled with hope. She's coming back. He must be getting better. But those of us who have walked this road many times know this is often not the start of recovery. It is a gift, a final window of light before the soul begins its departure. I remember a woman, frail and barely responsive for days, who suddenly sat up and asked to brush her hair. She smiled at her daughters, told each of them how proud she was, and then asked for tea. She passed peacefully the next morning. You see, these moments of clarity are not medical anomalies, they are sacred pauses. A deep breath of spirit before the final letting go. And if you are blessed enough to witness one, hold on to it gently. Say what you need to say, speak your love. Listen, even if it's just for a few minutes. And hold their hand like you may never get another chance, because sometimes you won't. And then be ready for the quiet again. Because after these moments pass, the body often begins its final withdrawal, not just from the world around it, but from the very rhythm of time. The sense of day and night, hours and minutes, starts to dissolve. And that leads us into the next sign, when time itself no longer seems to matter. 5. A quiet sense of readiness. There is a moment, often unspoken, often barely noticeable, when something shifts. The struggle softens. The holding on begins to ease, and though they may not say it aloud, you can feel it. They are ready. I've seen this countless times, and still, each time it comes, it humbles me. A father who suddenly says, "Take care of each other." A grandmother who asks for her wedding photo, gazes at it quietly, and says nothing more. A patient who smiles gently and whispers, "I've had a good life." These aren't dramatic declarations, they are simple gestures, a lingering look, a long-held hand, a gentle sigh, as though a great weight has been laid down. I remember one man who, after days of silence, looked at his daughter and simply said, "I'm tired, sweetheart, but I'm okay." He passed that night with her hand in his. There's a sacredness in this stage that words often cannot reach. You may feel a subtle pull, like you're being invited to be closer, to stay longer, and if you do, follow it. Don't wait. These are the moments when presence matters more than anything else in the world. Because when someone is ready to go, what they often need most is permission, not in words, but in your eyes, in your breath, in your stillness. A silent message that says, you are safe, you are loved, and you don't have to hold on anymore. And as that readiness deepens, time itself begins to blur. The structure of hours and days begins to fade, and the body begins its gentle detachment from the physical world. You may notice them sleeping through daylight or waking during the night. The old rhythms no longer apply. And that leads us into the next sign, when the sense of time begins to dissolve completely. 6. A natural withdrawal from conversation and social connection. Even the most talkative souls, the storytellers, the jokers, the ones who used to fill a room with their voice, begin to grow quiet. I've watched it happen gently, almost imperceptibly. Someone who once greeted every nurse by name now closes their eyes when you enter. A grandmother who used to ask about everyone's day simply sits in silence, her gaze distant, her lips still. And yet it's not sadness I see, not loneliness, it's something deeper, a kind of turning inward, a quiet retreat of the spirit. The world outside, with its noise and conversation, simply no longer calls to them, not because they are uninterested, but because they are beginning to listen to something else, something within. They might sit for hours without saying a word, and they're not bored. They're not waiting for entertainment, they're resting in a different kind of stillness. One that asks nothing, explains nothing, just is. And so I always tell families, you don't need to fill the silence. You don't need to cheer them up or draw them into small talk. Just be near, sit beside them, read a few lines from an old book, hold their hand without needing to speak. Because in this kind of silence, presence becomes its own kind of language. And often it speaks louder than words ever could. As this quiet deepens, something else often begins to shift as well. The senses, the very way they experience the world, become more delicate. What once felt comforting may now feel overwhelming. Bright lights, loud noises, even certain fabrics or temperatures may become too much. And so we come to the next sign, a growing sensitivity to the world around them, as the body continues its gentle letting go. 7. Heightened sensitivity to light, sound, and surroundings. As the body continues its quiet retreat from the world, the senses often begin to sharpen, not in strength, but in sensitivity. I've noticed this so often in my patients near the end of life. The overhead lights that once seemed fine now feel too harsh. The hum of a TV in the background becomes unsettling. Even a slightly wrinkled bedsheet or a stiff collar can cause visible discomfort. What once went unnoticed suddenly feels too much. It's as if the nervous system, already working so hard to hold the body together, no longer has the capacity to filter the noise, the brightness, the textures. The world becomes louder, heavier, more than they can bear. That's why I always tell families, this is the time to soften everything. Dim the lights. Choose warm amber tones over white. Keep the room quiet or fill it with something gentle, perhaps the sound of a soft piano or the rhythm of rain. Make sure their clothes are loose, their sheets smooth, their socks warm, because in this fragile stage, every small comfort becomes a great kindness. These details, so easily overlooked, send a message louder than any words. You are safe, you are cared for, you are not alone. And as the senses retreat and the body becomes more fragile, another shift often appears. This time, not in how they see the world, but in how they speak of it. Some begin to mention people who are no longer here. Others describe places they've never visited, gardens, lights, distant landscapes. And that brings us to the next sign, when those nearing the end begin to glimpse beyond what we can see. 8. The disappearance of time as we know it. As the senses soften and the body draws inward, another quiet change begins to unfold, one that families often find puzzling at first: the loss of time. Over the years, I've seen so many patients begin to slip out of our familiar rhythms. Day and night blur, meals no longer follow a schedule. They may sleep through sunlight and wake at midnight, eyes wide open, asking to talk, to share, or simply to be held. At first, families think it's confusion. Is she delirious? Is he losing track of reality? But I've come to understand it's not confusion at all. It's detachment. A natural loosening from the structure of physical time. You see, when someone is nearing the end of life, they are no longer bound to clocks and calendars. Their mind is moving differently now, perhaps already beginning to cross the edges of this life into something more timeless. And so I always tell loved ones, don't try to pull them back into our schedule. Don't insist they sleep at night or eat at noon. Instead, enter their rhythm. Let their inner world set the pace. Because sometimes, the most meaningful conversation you'll ever have may happen at 3 a.m. beneath a soft lamp, or in the stillness of afternoon, when no one expects anything at all. And as time fades, something even more mysterious can begin to surface. Something beyond time, beyond logic. Many patients begin to speak to people no one else can see. They smile at the corner of the room. They describe a light, a path, or a place they long to go. This brings us to the next sign, a moment when the veil between this world and the next begins to grow thin. 9. Speaking to those who have passed or describing another place. In my many years at the bedside, this is one of the most mysterious and deeply moving changes I've witnessed. Patients begin to speak of people who've long since passed. A mother who died decades ago, a brother lost in war, a childhood friend they haven't mentioned in years. Sometimes they speak aloud to them. Other times they smile quietly as if someone has just entered the room. Someone only they can see. I remember one woman who in her final days kept saying, "Papa's here. He's waiting in the garden." Her father had been gone for over 50 years, but to her in that moment, his presence was real, comforting, even joyful. Others speak of places, peaceful, beautiful places, a river, a meadow, a light in the distance. They describe these visions not with fear, but with calm, as if they are slowly being called home. Some families grow concerned, thinking it's a hallucination, but I've learned not to brush these moments aside. In fact, I see them as sacred. Because when someone begins to see beyond this world, it's not confusion, it's transition. Their soul is preparing, gently loosening its ties to this life, and somehow we are being invited to witness that sacred unfolding. So if your loved one begins to speak of someone who's gone, listen. Ask them to tell you more. Let your heart stay open. You don't have to understand it to honor it. You only have to be present and grateful. And often, when these glimpses begin to appear, the body starts its final descent into stillness. Breathing changes, circulation slows, the outer edges of life begin to fade. And so, we arrive at the last sign, the one that speaks through the rhythm of breath itself. 10. A profound stillness that fills the room. There is a kind of quiet that settles in near the very end. Unlike any other silence I've known, those of us who have been present at many passings often speak of it with reverence. It's not heavy with fear or sorrow, no. It's something else entirely. It's a stillness that feels sacred, as if time itself has paused, as if the room, the walls, even the very air is holding its breath. I remember sitting with a patient one evening. Her breathing had grown faint, her hands cool. No one was speaking, and yet we all felt it, that gentle weight of silence, as if something holy was unfolding. It wasn't sad. It was peaceful, full, like the closing of a beautiful song. You may feel it too, the change in the room, the slowing of everything around you. It might come with a hush in conversation, or a sudden urge to just be still. If that happens, don't be afraid. Don't rush to fill the space. This is the moment when presence means more than action. When your being there quietly is the greatest gift you can give. Let your breath slow, let your heart stay open, and let yourself witness what may be one of life's most sacred transitions. Because this stillness is often the final sign. The body softens, the soul prepares, and soon the breath will take its final bow. But before we close, I want to remind you, these signs are not meant to be feared. They are not warnings, they are invitations. Invitations to love more gently, to stay more present, to say what needs to be said, and to walk with someone all the way to the edge without turning away. Because in the end, we are not just witnessing death, we are honoring life, right to its very last breath. Thank you for staying with me through these reflections. I know that speaking about the end of life is never easy, but I've always believed that the more we understand it, the less we fear it. Because death in its own quiet way is not a failure, it is not an enemy. It is the final chapter of a story we've been writing since the day we were born. These 10 signs I've shared with you are not meant to frighten or sadden. They are here to help you notice, to recognize when someone you love is beginning their final steps. Not so you can hold them back, but so you can walk with them, gently, all the way. And along the way, you'll discover something unexpected, that the end of life is not all darkness. It is full of tenderness, of memory, of soft light. It's filled with chances to say thank you, to say I forgive you, to say I love you one more time. So if you are going through this right now, if someone you love is showing these signs, my heart is with you. Don't be afraid to slow down, to sit quietly, to let go of fixing and simply be there. In my 90 years, I've learned that what matters most at the end is not how many days remain, but how fully we live in the ones we still have. Be present, be kind, and let love be the last thing they hear, the last thing they feel. That, above all, is what it means to walk someone home. Thank you for listening. I'm honored you've allowed me to share this with you.